Good morning. Hello. Hope you're doing okay. It's just me here again with another little message for you. Well, Wellen has hit the headlines. Some of you will have caught up that we hit the national press, the Sunday Telegraph, and then a couple of places followed up on radio. Because, as you know, there's been quite a lot of discussion about the sort of changes to the high streets, both now and going forward. So I thought I'd say a little word about that, and particularly about the sort of the traders and businesses that were sort of campaigning for a change. Now, immediately at this point, there's going to be a kind of bit of a worry, why as director, surely you should be talking about spiritual matters, not about sort of commerce. Well, I'm not going to go into fine detail, but actually I think there is something to be said. Now, people very often will quote at this point, two sayings of Jesus, either the kind of, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, or, Jesus overturning the money changes in the temple and say that shows that you shouldn't be concerned with that world. Well, we could do a bit of a Bible study on those two, interesting as they are, what they're about. But that would take too much time. Suffice to point out, the rest of the Bible is full of stuff, and I mean, literally mean that. Far more than, for instance, there is about sort of sexuality or anything like that. About kind of economic justice, about treating people fairly, about looking after the poor, about sort of matters of sort of prosperity and flourishing and enabling people to have what they need. So these things are not absent from the Bible. In fact, these issues are very, very central to the Bible, because they're central to what it means to be a human being and to flourish as a human being, which is what God wants for us. I will have, and this is entirely a digression, I think one of the nicest points that perhaps gets overlooked in that bit of render unto Caesar what is Caesar's is Jesus's sort of slightly sarcastic wit at that point, because they've come to him and said, look, we don't like carrying around these coins because they've got the idolatrous image of the emperor on them. And Jesus says sort of, oh yeah, that is a problem. Oh, can I look at one of the coins? Because I haven't got one. And of course, one of them gets out the coin and shows it to him. And the point is, of course, oh, so you are actually carrying the coin where you shouldn't be. Oh, okay. So we missed that little trick, I think, but it's actually quite sort of amusing, I always think, at that point, that Jesus does that little trick. Anyway, as I say, that was a digression. But as I say, I think, issues of economic justice and how we make communities flourish are very much at the heart of the Christian faith. Sometimes people say, it's not all about money. There's more important things than money. And that's true. It's perfectly true. But very often people who say that, have to say, are, quite comfortably off. I think probably, the super rich are slightly obsessed by money often. But I think that sort of, there's more important things, which is quite right, is often said by people who have, comfortably off. I think, having lived in Pakistan, in a desperately poor country, and met some desperately poor people, the one thing I remember there is the people who really do obsess about money are the very, very poor. And if we're going to look after them, as the Bible tells us to, then actually we are going to have to talk about money. Because actually, if you haven't got enough, food to feed your children, you don't think about much else, actually. And so one of the things I think I learned from my time living there is actually, if you're a very poor person, really all you have time to think about is money. And that's one of the reasons to try and alleviate the situation they are in. Well, I hope there's nobody quite at that level in Welwyn. But we have been thinking, as I say, in the past couple of weeks about perhaps the businesses on the high street. So for those of you who haven't caught up, basically, since the one-way system and the barriers have been put up, there's been a marked decline in the amount of business done in the village. and even more than the initial lockdown. So that was at a level, and then it went down quite significantly. So it's not so much COVID-19; it's actually restrictions there put in place in order to, I mean, fair enough, to try and protect people from COVID-19. And then to look forward what that might mean. And so, I say, there's been a bit of a campaign about this. Now, I mean, it won't take a genius to work out where I'm coming from, but I actually, rather than get sort of embroiled in all that again, you can read all about it online and Facebook and stuff. I want to just instead make us think, because I think what's happening a bit for a lot of us, and I sort of include myself at times in this, not just now, but at other times, in that we don't sort of terribly join up our thinking. So I'm going to show you what you might think about these issues. I'm going to give 2 or 3 contrasting viewpoints, which I think are coherent. But then I'm going to give you one, which I think is what a lot of people might be thinking. And that's the one I'm going to challenge on, because I think it's not coherent. So let me explain. Let's start from the beginning. So the campaign has said, look, we know that COVID-19 is dangerous, but also we want the village to survive in all shapes and forms, including the businesses. And actually, the measures of one way and barriers are just too draconian. There's no need for them. We were coping beforehand really pretty well. The shops have all got their kind of, they've put the precautions necessary into place. We could do without the kind of traffic and barrier restrictions, etc., to try and get and to keep those businesses in the village. So that's an overreaction, fair enough, done in the best possible reasons, but now let's take it down. Okay, so that's been what the campaign has said, and I think that you might not agree with it, but it's a perfectly kind of coherent way of thinking. Now, that's not to say there aren't other coherent ways of thinking. I'm going to kind of give you 3 others. The first one is an obvious one, which is, and this, is a simple warning that, I mean, there are some people who really it's not safe for them to be going out. They're shielding. They've got sort of deep underlying health issues, and they ought to stay at home as much as possible. So that's fine. We don't want anybody who's in those risk categories to risk anything. But of course, many of us aren't, let's face it, in those risk categories. I'm not, and you may not be. So, of the rest of us, I say there are a couple of coherent views. You might say, in all honesty, I've hardly ever used any of the amenities or businesses in the village. I know other people do, but frankly, it doesn't bother me if they go and it's turned into housing. Really, well, that's life. I do my commerce, my business elsewhere. Now, not saying that's right, but yeah, I can understand that's a coherent position. You might also say, well, look, I know it's really difficult with traders, and I do like the traders, etc., etc., but COVID-19 is really serious, and I'm really quite frightening, and we've got to have these restrictions. I'm sorry, I just believe that's the only way to get through this. I understand that we might lose the businesses, and I regret that, and I'll be sad about it, but I'm going into that with my eyes open. Now, again, you may or may not agree with that, but it's a kind of coherent point of view. Now, my problem is the last one, and I think this is the way a lot of people are thinking, and it is sometimes what I think about these sorts of things. And I think this is where we need to be a bit challenging as Christians. And there's a thinking that goes something like this: is that I like the fact that our villages, our village in particular, has kind of businesses. There's a few shops you can go to, have your lunch, haircut, pop into Tesco's, buy a violin and a house. There's a few things you can do without going out of the village. It's got buses going through it in both directions, etc., etc. I like all of that, and I'm not quite sure with the barriers and the car parking and all that one-way system. I'm not going to go there for the next 6 months or however long these things last. But after that, when I go down, I expect to be able to do all these things, and I'm going to be pretty indignant if I find, the cafe is gone, you can't go to a pub, whatever the other shops you can't get a haircut, whatever. I mean, at that point, I have to say, well, I'm afraid you can't be terribly indignant because, what did you think would happen if, while those restrictions are up, nobody went there? It is a kind of sort of wishful thinking in a way. Of course, it is. It would be great to think, isn't it, that we don't have to support anything for for however long it takes, but then it will all be there for us at the end of it. And of course, I'm afraid, yeah, the trouble is that that just isn't true. I mean, already businesses are looking at balance sheets and just saying, is this feasible? And I know other people will say things like, well, you can park and walk, you can, yeah, it is a bit, but you could go in. And that's fine. I mean, if people are doing it, but if they're not, they're not. And sometimes you get this in the church as well. People say, the church isn't about money, mustn't always be talking about money. And I think absolutely quite right. And I never really want to talk about money. I want it to come in. But then you do have to say to people sometimes, like a business, but there is a bottom line. What happens when we can't pay the bills anymore? What do we do? And that's the sort of situation traders and businesses are going to be in soon. What do we do if we can't pay the bills? Because there are economic bottom lines. What do you do if your house is going to be repossessed? What do you do if a nation can't pay for its health service? What do you do if you haven't got enough money to feed your children? These are kind of economic bottom lines, and Christians ought to be really concerned about them. So, as I say, you may have a variety of views, but I just want you to think through what you're thinking and make sure that your view, in a sense, is coherent. There's not just wishful thinking. You're not just expecting everything to be there waiting for you, because, frankly, it isn't. Probably the one thing I forgot to mention, a bit of a technical thing, but it just kind of came in news that there was a bit of kind of, well, is this for the upgrade for the smart motorway? I mean, we have now heard that actually the smart motorway is quite a long way away. So I think we can kind of forget about that. What's there is probably for the duration of COVID-19, however long that is. So we need to decide what's a proportionate response. And say I'm not necessarily saying that campaign has the right answers. What I am saying is each of us need to think through, and when we act as consumers or as we act as churchgoers, whenever we act kind of economically, there are real bottom lines that we have to think about. Just as we do for our own families, we have to think about, how are we going to survive as an individual and as a family, as a household? We need to do our budgeting. As I say, when it comes to budgeting as a small business, as a shop, as a village, as a nation, paying for its health service and thinking about, for instance, what taxes we ought to pay, we just need to be realistic and joined up in our thinking. And that matter of bringing, therefore, sort of flourishing and economic justice to communities is as much a part of the Christian faith as any other part of life. Thank you. God bless.